So good afternoon, everyone. This is Audrey Russo, President and CEO of the Pittsburgh Technology Council, kicking off a Monday. I know that today is Yom Kippur, and I wish good Yontif to all those that celebrate this holiday, me included, but I'm here because I wanted to make sure that I got a chance to spend some time with our guest, who I'm very excited about. And I want to thank Huntington Bank. Huntington Bank has been with us right from the onset of this interesting journey of having daily conversations with people from Pittsburgh and from around the world. And today is no different. So I'm excited about that and thanking Huntington. Jonathan Kirsting is joining us today. And we want to make this interactive. We want to make this so that you can have an opportunity to talk with our guest, but we have a lot to pack in. So I'll warn you, we have a lot to pack in. So we've muted your microphones and there is a chat. So use the chat. We will work with you on that. Jonathan will monitor the questions. So I'm thrilled to introduce Matthew. He goes by Matt Marolda. He is the Chief Analytics Officer. He's an EVP. I would say that titles probably don't matter that much, but what really matters is what you're going to hear is all that he's been involved in. But he is EVP at Tulco Holdings, and they've had some noteworthy investments. They've had some noteworthy work, and they have a very, very interesting model. So I want to bring on Matt. I think, Matt, you unmuted yourself. If you could unmute. Sometimes it gets wonky. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So Matt, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You are joining us from Boston. Is that correct?
That is correct. I'm in Boston. Yep.
Yes. So thank you, Matt. And, you know, listen, you have a very, very impressive career. And it's sort of interesting to figure out like your entire journey. But I know from talking with you, it's really been fascinating. I've yet to meet someone who's had this kind of spread, particularly with the data analytics background. So it seems like maybe the company Stratbridge is where you want to start, or how do you want to start to talk about who is Matt, the man?
Sure. Always an awkward topic for me, but I'll do the best I can. So Stratbridge probably is a decent place to start. That's the company I started many years ago, and out of Stratbridge sprung 3 different businesses that I eventually sold all of, and they led me to kind of the next stages of my career. They seem sort of disparate and unrelated, but there is a commonality, which you identified, which is data. At the time, no one really talked about data science, but data analytics, and so on. The 3 businesses that sprung out of that company, one was one that did predictions for publicly traded companies around the world for whether they were going to commit fraud or fail based on publicly available data. So kind of a cool early prediction engine, which now would probably run on my iPhone, but used to run on many servers in a room. And then from there, and these are all random walks we can either dive into or not, we found our way over to dynamic pricing of tickets for professional sports. And so did that for much of the NBA, MLB, NHL. And then from there, that led to what I guess people colloquially call Moneyball. So working with professional teams across mostly NFL and NBA, using data and analytics to be smart about player evaluation, coaching, and so on. That's how, in that world, and again, all 3 of those businesses I sold now maybe more than 10 years ago, but at different times. But that's how I met Thomas Tull, who is obviously an ardent Pittsburgh person. And I met him through his partial ownership of the Steelers. And we get to know each other that way. That's because of my sports world. And he basically, after a few years of getting to know him, or a couple of years, pitched me and said, would you like to come to Hollywood and do Moneyball in Hollywood? And so I said, sure, because it sounded like the next cool thing to do. And so we took Legendary Entertainment, which is the company founded, and really infused data analytics throughout its entire process, including both the project selection, everything from titles to casting and so on. And none of it was ever weirdly robotic. I mean, it was all interlaced with human perception and whatnot, but intuition. But it was an important component. And then probably even more aggressively, we use data analytics to market our products, right? So market our movies and TV shows and so on. That led to a sale of Legendary to Wanda, a large Chinese conglomerate, back in 2016. And then Thomas left about a year or so later. And then I was able to take my division and sell it from there to Warner Media, which is Warner Brothers, HBO, all the Turner properties. So that's sort of like the arc.
Yeah, that's a big arc. And so any commonalities in terms of the sports franchise and what was happening at Legendary at the time? Any kind of?
Yeah, no, there are quite a few, I think. The first thing is these are human-driven things, right? Whether it's a athletic sort of endeavor, like a game or whatnot, or even a creative process like the production of a movie or TV show, there's a real human element to it. And so that part you have to accept and acknowledge and kind of incorporate, right, integrate. The other piece is they're both very ambiguous, meaning you can't, like if you're doing data science in a way that you prefer, you'd like to be able to have two different worlds, right? One world where you did something and another world where you did the opposite thing. You can sort of run a horse race and see which one did better and then make your choice. Well, you can't really do that. you can't sort of run those kinds of tests. And so you have to operate in a way that data has to both feather into these more human aspects of either creativity or athletics or human judgment, alongside the fact that you can't really do the same kind of testing you would like to do in a more pure data environment. That's similar between both entertainment and sports.
But on the entertainment side, did you get involved in deciding what, because these films out of Legendary are huge, they're massive budgets. So did you get involved at the onset? Did you get involved at the post after it was in the distributive?
Sure. I would describe it as if you were some data visualization kind of person. So I would think of it, if you think of a chart that looks like a bathtub, high, then low, then high. So high at the beginning, meaning these are major investments. And in a certain way, you're investing like you would in any other investment. You want to be informed and thoughtful and incorporate as much information as you can. And so we'd be very involved at those early stages. I mean, it's long enough now that some of the ones that I can think of right off the top of my head, like a Jurassic World or Straight Outta Compton, those are ones that in hindsight looked like huge wins that were no-brainers, but at the time, not only were they significant investments, but there was uncertainty around those movies and the properties. And so we were very involved in evaluating audience opportunity, scale, and trying to match that to budget and to what would the investment would basically be to fund it and to support it. We would also get very involved in some very broad brushstroke stuff as an input to the creative process. So I think of a movie like Kong, Skull Island, which we did 4 years ago now, and how we sort of learned from a movie like Godzilla and brought those learnings from a data perspective to a Kong. And if you actually compare and contrast those two movies, which I'd be happy to do, you can sort of see some of the changes that occurred because of that. And so that's like the very beginning. That's that sort of the spike at one end of the bathtub. Then we go quiet. So we're not involved in the script writing, or we never were involved in that part really at all. We weren't involved in the production. Like I'd go to a movie set because it's a cool thing to do, but I did nothing other than just kind of hang around. And then, it'd be quiet. And then the movie would start getting ready to go into the market and we'd really crank back up again. And at that point we'd say, okay, now how do we take this movie and deliver it to to these very large populations around the world, right? And what kind of techniques and analytics can we use to position the movie in a way that will make it stand out in what is not just a competitive landscape, for entertainment, but just, people's time, right? Think about the zero sort of sum of time that people have. How do you get out of that fray? So that's where the bathtub kind of kicked back up again, was when it came to the actual propagation and birthing of the property out into the world.
And so would you say that that's prevalent now in Hollywood? My research on all this is that it wasn't that prevalent back then.
Oh, it definitely wasn't prevalent then. This is where Thomas had so I never, like you heard about the randomness of my career, I was fortunate that at each of those junctures, someone kind of came to me and said, hey, could you do this? That's a very fortunate, lucky thing. And so he was that person. He's the one who kind of saw, in this case, around the corner and said, hey, what really, and I'll sort of paraphrase him, but one of the things that really caught him was I think the second Hangover movie. He got this bill basically for media, and it had like all these advertisements on like Lifetime Network, and there's all these newspaper ads. He's like, why is that happening? Why would you ever do that for this Hangover movie? Right. And that's what got him thinking about it. And so that's when we started talking about it. So yes, it was very unusual there. In fact, I think some people looked at us like we had two heads because it was a very creatively driven place. Not only is the actual product creative, but the people who rise up in the ranks across organizations tend to have come from creative backgrounds. And so data and data analytics, any approach like that was very foreign to them, just like it was in sports, you know, in my sort of prior life to that. And so it was very uncommon. Then I think we released it among those, and you know, if you're going to be grandiose about it, we were maybe a catalyst for thinking about things in that way. But the world was changing around us. Like Thomas was prescient, but it wasn't like it was not going to happen. Right. So I think we were early and did some of the more sophisticated things. But even with digital marketing, when I started in Hollywood, which would have been maybe like 8 or 9 years ago, 90% of our media budgets were on TV. And by the time, you know, one of our first movies that we really shook up things, we thought it was crazy at the time. I think we did like 60% on TV, and people thought we were nuts. And the remainder was like on digital. And now things are shifting so much that like everything is like very digitally driven. So the world has changed. I think the part that hasn't changed yet is some of the cultural aspects. I think some of these large organizations, or media organizations, have not quite got their head fully around how to take advantage of it. They don't have the agility in some cases, and they have other sort of infrastructural things that make it hard. But they've definitely come a long way since say, 8 or 9 years ago.
So which of the movies was the one that really made this validity testing, sealed? Which was there one movie where it was
well, so I have a lot. I have over the course of my career, we launched, I don't know, 60 or 70 movies, and wow. That's so quite a few, and that's largely driven by Warner Brothers because there's so many there. Over 3 years, we did like 60, I think. Well, maybe not 60, 50 something. But the ones that always stick out are, and this is, I don't know if this is a indictment on my sort of the way I looked at the world, but the some that stick out were the very early ones and the really bad ones. The really big successes are almost easier to kind of brush aside. The early ones, though, the one that really sort of hit the mark, if you will, and I think caught some attention was Godzilla. That was 2014. So we had like a year or two to really ramp up and build for that movie. And we did a lot of things there that were unique in the way we approached it. And one of the things, if you go back and look at it, you'll sort of see this. And it's kind of funny, and I hate to say it, but I would do it again. We looked at that movie and said, hey, we need to make this big, right? We need to make it broad. And we found opportunities with women, actually, who were between the ages of like, I want to say it was like late 20s to like 40-ish, which would have been surprising. You wouldn't have necessarily anticipated that for a Godzilla movie. But what we found, once you start peeling back the onion there, was it wasn't just the demographic. There were certain aspects that they were appealing to them. There's conspiracy theory kind of baked into the movie. There was a bit of, it ended up not really playing out this way. There's a bit of sort of a dynamic between husband and wife and a young kid. And then Bryan Cranston had just come off of Breaking Bad. And so he was like this huge star. And so those three things as elements were ones that we identify as, which people, through data that I don't think people would have anticipated that we really wanted to lean into. And so we did. So we found a market segment that we went after, and we took the creative materials and crafted them toward those things. The conspiracy, the sort of dynamics of family, and Bryan Cranston. And it worked. We opened up to like almost $100 million and so on. If you watch the movie, those things are not super prominent. So I wouldn't ever use it to determine bait and switch, because it wasn't that at all. But it was something where we took elements and amplified them. And we knew we wanted to open big. And we knew that, especially at that time, the way the math works, it kind of cascades. And if you can open big, then you set a long tail, you could earn a lot of money. And so that was the strategy for that one. That one worked really well. The one right behind it, actually, the immediate movie after, was this tiny little horror movie that I'm sure probably no one on this call has heard of, called As Above, So Below. So this movie was kind of cursed because it has a mouthful of a title. I can barely even say it. It was like super small budget, whereas Godzilla was like a $180 million movie. This is like a $5 million movie. Oh, wow. A much lower spend. It was just very small, but we went radical on that one. We did all kinds of really innovative things in the market, especially, and it really kind of worked. It became a very profitable movie. It made actually a bunch of money, and it broke a lot of paradigms. And that's the one where other people in Hollywood started calling us and saying, hey, what are you guys doing? Like, what is actually happening there? Because the Godzilla one, it was like, oh, it's a big property, and you can kind of, tout your analytics on it, but it's still Godzilla. This is this tiny little movie. How did it do anything? So those two were literally back to back, separated by about 4 months. And those were the two that I think really kind of like shone a light on it and actually frankly convinced me that there was actually something there.
And then you were involved in Dark Knight?
No, that was right before me. The last movie I touched, but it was these are the movies that came right after Dark Knight.
Right after. I can't, it's all blurring to me since COVID.
Sure. Yeah. No, these are the immediate successive movies after that. Yeah.
Right. So how do you feel right now when you're watching what's happening in Hollywood?
Well, I feel like a dinosaur and I feel out of touch. so like, I already feel like the world has changed. So I left Warner Media and joined Tulco in March, right before the pandemic really, the things really went crazy. And so since that time, and I've stayed in touch with my friends there, obviously, the world has changed so radically. I mean, Warner Brothers has released one movie since then, which was aggressive. It was a movie called Tenet, which is a Christopher Nolan movie, which has struggled to do anything in the box office just because people aren't going to the movies. Meanwhile, when I left Warner Media, we also were launching HBO Max, which is the Netflix competitor. Right. And that was a really challenging thing to do and a very hard task. And so those things are all like, sea changes, right? You've got the economy changing radically. You've got distribution and how properties move around. But even as we were leaving, like there's a movie called Scoob, this is all public. Scoob is going to be released in theaters. It's based on Scooby-Doo. And it was very clear that Scooby-Doo is a beloved property, but, has a very specific kind of audience. And especially given the pandemic, that was the kind of thing that made a lot of sense to switch over. So they went from planning to release it in theaters to actually releasing it digitally and putting it right on HBO Max. And it's a really clever thing to see. I mean, other studios have done similar things. And so these shifts are happening so fast, and the advantage this is the only part that I would say I regret leaving behind, but as a data person, you don't get a lot of data from a theatrical release or even a television show, right? So there's very little you can actually learn other than secondary signals like social media or other conversation you might be able to pick up, or, sort of digital, ephemeral things. Whereas when you have a platform like HBO Max, and you can actually get significant first-party data off of, say, a movie like Scoob, that's a hugely game-changing thing. So that's why I feel like a dinosaur, because that's happened just as I kind of left.
How fast it's moved, and how slow at the same
Crazy.
time. I mean, I think you articulate.
That's right.
But let's just wheel back a little bit in terms of the work that you've done in data analytics in sports and in coaching across the franchises, because that's how you got involved with Thomas, I believe, through the Steelers.
That's right. Yep. That's right. Yeah. So very similar conditions. I think the movie Moneyball had a scene which I could relate to because I'd actually experienced it. There's a scene where like the old scouts were all talking about the way the guy walked across the field, or even his girlfriend, which they would talk about, and things like that. I've been in rooms where there's a scout who literally fell asleep on his cane. So these things are like, they were real, like that world was real. And it was an interesting uphill battle in the sense of bringing this perspective to that world, meaning could you take things like data and other sort of quantitative measures that folks were maybe not comfortable with or hadn't even experienced before and employ them in the decision-making processes, whether it was, again, on a player evaluation basis or even on a coaching basis. And that was an interesting path. One thing that was sort of a second order thing I learned, I was effectively a vendor, meaning I had a company that licensed that technology and software to the teams. And one of the things I learned, which I appreciated when I switched over and jumped into Hollywood with Thomas, was you can only affect so much as the party who's providing the tools. To actually have a true seat at the table from a decision-making perspective can actually amplify the impact kind of dramatically. I think one of the things that's happened in sports since, which makes a lot of sense, the tools like the ones that are even still stemming off the ones that my team and I had built that are still in the market to this day for the acquirer, they've taken a direction that kind of shifts more of the sort of decision-making power back to the team, which is great because at the time a lot of them would rely on us to sort of help even interpret it and open up even more kind of raw data. And the teams now have such deep skill sets on staff to be able to take advantage of the data that they actually can do more of it in-house like we were able to do at Legendary. So I think that's a pretty stark, but probably pretty typical transition for an industry, is to see that early kind of outside the organization development of tools and capabilities being licensed in and then eventually brought fully in-house. So that transition seems to have happened pretty thoroughly in
Where's
sports.
that skill set lie inside the franchises? Is it in marketing? Are they hiring?
So I think I'm a little out of touch. I've stayed in touch with friends, but not in a professional way, in the sense of I haven't professionally kind of dug in. But my observation is that, so I'm tight with like the Red Sox guys, for example. They've built up a really impressive analytics team within the organization, that's in what they would call the front office, right? So working with like the general manager and the manager and so on. Other organizations have more sort of centralized data functions that spread across business as well. So things like marketing, sponsorship, and so on. So yeah, I've seen a mix. I think they tend to be a little specialized, right? So you tend to have people sort of specialized in the player side of it or the business side of it, but they definitely cultivate. I've seen organizations cultivate both for sure.
Good, and it's right at the front office side. It's no longer back office.
Correct. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
that's total. Did you get involved in security related things or not?
Not particularly. When we say security, do you mean like digital security or?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So we were very conscious of that, in the sense that another thing that we did that was new was we were a multi-tenant infrastructure, which is a sort of a mouthful, but what it means is that, and it's kind of weird, but all the teams were basically the same database. So if you think about the hyper competitiveness of those teams, we had to convince them that this was a better infrastructure for them. So we had to be really tight on security, and had to take a lot of precaution.
Like in my old days, they were all in a single instance. Is that?
Kind of, yeah.
Oh.
I mean, there was a lot of precautions within there. Like it's what Salesforce was doing at the time, right? So a lot of companies were doing it. It wasn't unusual in that sense, but it was unusual to them. And again, so it put a heightened attention on things like security. We never had one issue, because I always said if we had one issue, that's a going out of business issue. Like you're done. So like never was a problem, and it worked out just fine. But it was something we had to spend a lot of time thinking about.
So you're there. It's totally partitioned. That's really interesting. I would never have thought about that.
Yeah, it had to be for scale and efficiency. Yeah, we had to do it that way.
Good opportunity for data centers too. So
Yes.
That's great. So now let's jump into this role that you have at Tulco. And let's just talk about Tulco, because there's a couple of companies in there that are, have done or are doing quite well.
Oh, extremely well, yeah.
You have an interesting model. If you could sort of talk about that, because I think people in Pittsburgh would be interested to hear about this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the model, again, this is where, again, Thomas sometimes sees around the corner, or oftentimes he'll see around the corner. I think what he identified, and Hollywood was a very big example of this, is there are these industries that are maybe, I don't want to call them sleepy necessarily, but ones that have sort of an older point of view or an older approach, or a more staid approach, that they are often ripe for some disruption simply by incorporating data and analytics, right? So there's a very simplifying kind of elegance to that hypothesis, right? Which is if you take something that's traditionally been in an older business and infuse it with this new perspective and approach and capability, you can actually immediately manifest two benefits. And I always think about it kind of simply as increasing like EBITDA or profit, and then increasing the EBITDA multiple, which is how people will sometimes shorthand value something, right? So if you make $100 and you have an EBITDA multiple of 5, you're worth $500. If you can make the EBITDA go up to 200 and make the EBITDA multiple go up to 10, suddenly you're at 2,000. And so taking these approaches and saying, what can we do to affect both the actual core business and its sort of trajectory, which is the representation of profit and value, is again sort of an elegant solution. And so there are a handful of companies in the portfolio. The strategy has been to take a very controlling, if not controlling, very material stake in those businesses, and to then collaborate with them and work with them. And so one of them that you may be thinking of is Figs, which is a medical apparel company, total rocket ship, and also very interesting. Thomas introduced me to the women who founded that company 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even more than that. And they were usually, it's one of those things where they walk in the room like these two people have it, like whatever it is that they have.
Well, tell me what Figs is. So
Figs started it from, again, like a lot of things, from a place of sort of not necessarily driven by like, how do I make a ton of money? It was a woman whose friend was a nurse who, and this woman was in fashion, and her friend who was a nurse was wearing these uncomfortable scrubs. like scratchy, poorly cut, uncomfortable scrubs. And this woman who is now the co-CEO of Figs said to herself, well, I can make you something better than that. And she did. And then suddenly everyone wanted them, and they turned that concept into what is now a many $100 million business, $1 million a year revenue business. And so it's very impressive that they kind of started from that place. And they were also very early on the sort of mission-driven side. Every pair of scrubs, there's a matching pair that goes to a medical worker in need somewhere in the world. So they've been doing that since day one, which is really impressive. And so what they've done is they've said, you know what, we're going to be direct to consumer, right, which is very different than how the industry is. And so where Tulco's involvement came in was, first of all, of course, funding, right, giving them the capital to drive the business, but also to give them capabilities to be more data-centric. Right? If you're going to be a direct-to-consumer scrubs company, basically, you need to really understand the people who are buying your scrubs. And you need to be able to get them to buy them again at a frequency that's like, say, once a year or more. You need to be able to get them to buy more things. Like, so if you go from scrubs to outerwear even, or as you might imagine, masks now are very popular. How do you basically increase their shopping cart? And then how do you grow that core in and of itself, right? How do you find more of those people? And so there's a lot of ways that we've been able to think about data and analytics that help them push those envelopes further, again, increase both the actual profit of the company, but the value as well.
So Tulco Holdings actually will get data scientists and then place them inside the companies that they invest in.
Yeah. So my role is to sort of provide all the support you would think that we would need to provide them, right? It's how do you actually embed these capabilities in your organization? How do you build a culture around data to incorporate it into your everyday thing? It's one thing to say, hey, let's look at all these great dashboards. The other thing to actually have data flow into every conversation and be a meaningful seat at the table. So it's helping them to, again, I think it's a really important thing that these are capabilities that are built and reside within the company, right? That have to be something that is, a strength of the company. And so I think we've done a really, and this even predates me because I was at Warner Media for a time before coming to Tulco, when Tulco was still up and running. The people have been there, since the beginning, have been doing an amazing job of building, skill sets of people who can then, parachute in these companies and then land permanently and build these capabilities. So yeah, that's been the model, and it is pretty unique. I'm not aware of a lot of other places doing that specifically.
Right. And then you're also invested in an insurance company.
Yes. Yeah. Another classic. Yeah. Yeah. Another classic one where it's an industry that's huge, obviously. Scrubs is huge, believe it or not, but insurance is obviously huger. And they also have a lot of data, right? They've used some form of what you might call data science for decades. Actuarial data is a version of that. But there are aspects of it that could be reinvigorated. And so Tulco incubated two companies within it, one being a modern marketing engine for insurance, and the other being a modern risk engine for insurance. Took those two companies and was able to strike a pretty significant partnership with a company called Acrisure, which is, I think, the country's largest brokerage, one of the largest brokerages in the country. That gave us a significant and material stake in that business, but also enable us to do the same thing, which is to embed capabilities into an organization and help, again, achieve both profit and value growth.
So are you still investing in companies? Are you still looking to invest?
So as of now, the focus is on taking the tigers we have by the tail and making sure that they continue to be successful.
Well, so what's your predictions for the next year? What do you think? I mean, you're a data scientist. Is there any, can we ask you anything? Dirk wrote something in here. What can you tell us about data analytics applied to politics? But I'm interested in what trends do you see?
I would feel a lot more confident answering that question prior to the COVID than I am now, just because things are so dynamically changing. I think so. Politics is fascinating in and of itself. I personally dipped into some of that in the past. Data is clearly used extensively, sometimes scarily, sometimes inappropriately by all sides. Like, it's not one side or the other. It's just a fact of modern politics. In terms of trends, I think the things that are going to be really fascinating to watch, and again, I'm going to bias this wildly towards my worlds, so these are not meant to be grand projections or predictions or anything, but just like how at least why I touch it every day or have touched. sports and media, like those things are going to change radically. I think media and sports will come back once people can, sports is back in a lot of ways for sure, but it'll feel more real again once crowds are back. And that's probably a vaccine, right, before you can really do that. But on the media side, like we were talking about earlier, what everyone calls over the top, like the over the top aspects of that business, where you can suddenly start taking digital platforms and deploying media out through them, is huge. And that's a game changing thing. So I think that world is going to change radically towards a more home oriented world. There'll be different kinds of movies that actually come into the theaters that are bigger, maybe more of a theatrical experience, where other things might go on different platforms. So that's disrupting dramatically. When it comes to the businesses that Tulco is in today, I think we're seeing a lot of trends that are exciting. I mean, I think insurance is something that is a product that's going to be very important to people, and being able to deliver that to them in a way that's efficient and gives them information to be an informed purchaser of those products is, it's part of the mission. When it comes to medical apparel, again, I mean, obviously those are frontline workers that everyone feels very strongly towards, especially now. So being able to serve them really well and know those people really well, at a scale that figures out, you need data analytics to be able to do that. And so these things I think will continue just mushroom. Where it goes from there, I don't know. It's hard to imagine.
It was hard to imagine 6 months ago when you joined Tulco that this was that we
completely.
So before we end, what's your favorite movie?
Favorite movie that I've worked on, or favorite movie in my life?
How about both? Answer both.
Okay. Of my life, I am too data centric to not have a curated list that has many variables at any given moment is good. But I will say movies I think of as ones that pop in. Of course, there's all the cliches, right? So you can just jot down all of the typical Godfather, Goodfellas type movies. But even something and some of these were from when I was a kid. Something like a Young Frankenstein or Midnight Run. Those kinds of movies are ones that stick out for me. Of ones I've worked on, certainly there've been some great ones that were really fun. Joker was a really interesting, crazy movie. A Star is Born was a really fun one to work on. Of course, Godzilla, Kong. But weirdly, and I'm just partly out of a selfish motivation to get people to watch it. There was a movie we did called Game Night at Warner Brothers, which is this fun kind of movie. It's probably good for this time where people are looking for some escapism. But that was a movie that we didn't really have much hope for, and we were able to flip around and do something cool with. Another movie that was like that was The Meg, which came out a couple years ago, which is basically Jason Statham punching a shark. And so that was a fun movie that we thought wouldn't really go anywhere and became quite successful. And so the movies that were kind of, the ones that I'll always remember were the ones that were fun, that we were able to take and create some outcomes beyond the expectation.
Right, which is exciting. Okay, so I guess you stay connected to sports. I'm not going to ask you your favorite sports team because you're in Boston.
I'm a depressed sports fan today because my favorite team lost last night in the playoffs, the Celtics. So. Oh,
that's right. Okay, yeah, we have everything but professional basketball here. So
that's right.
Envious of that. But I want to shout out, if people want to know more about Tulco, they go to tulcoholdings.com.
Yes. Yep.
And I want to thank Matt Marolda, who's EVP with Tulco Holdings. And as you heard, what a great background that you've had. So the next thing that I want to follow up with you on is see what you're doing in music. I feel like that's an area
I am involved in a company that's doing some things in music that we can talk about some other time. Yeah.
Well,
it's a teaser.
I'll back up with you.
Yep.
So I can't thank you enough for taking the time with us. Stay safe, stay connected, and really appreciate the work that you do.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's really fun to chat with you.
Same here. Take care, everyone. And tomorrow we have, who do we have tomorrow, Jonathan? We have Maven Machines.
Avi, yes, very cool guy. And of course, on Wednesday, the founder and CEO of Aurora stopping by, for crying out loud. Come on, that's going to be awesome.
Great. So Matt, you can join in. There's some really great companies that are right here in Pittsburgh.
Great.
You probably don't know.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, so we will send you a link. Anyway, thanks everyone. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.